International Workers' Day. That's a day that's celebrated around the world, but not here in the United States or Canada. They're probably the only two industrialized countries that don't celebrate it. Same movement, okay. But the idea is International Workers' Day is designed to celebrate workers and the contribution that they make to society. So given that background, today seemed like a good day to talk about the renewed interest that we're seeing in unions and whether they are a hope to improve conditions of employment for workers in the United States. It's hard not to pay attention to the news and not notice all the attention that union organizing efforts at Starbucks and Amazon have received in the media. Over 200 Starbucks stores have expressed interest in unionism. Got to keep that in perspective. There's about 9,000 Starbucks stores in the country, and out of that 200, a little over 20 now have actually voted in union representation. The other big organizing drive that received lots of attention was at an Amazon warehouse in Staten Island, New York, where the union won an election over a very anti-union company. Very few expected to see successful union organizing in companies like Amazon and Starbucks. Something seems to be changing, and that's what I want to talk about this morning. I want to put these recent organizing drives into a historical perspective and then speculate something about some of the possible consequences or implications of the what I think is a new direction for unionism in the United States. Before proceeding, I just want to address what I think is a reasonable question, and that is, why should we as UUs care about the unionization of baristas at Starbucks or order pickers and delivery drivers at an Amazon warehouse? I'll argue that we should be concerned because as a caring community interested in promoting welfare of others and making the world a better place, we can do that by supporting the decision of workers to unionize, and by doing so, we can promote interests in justice, equity, and compassion in the workplace. Disgruntled workers at Starbucks and Amazon who turn to union representation only represent the tip of the iceberg. There are literally millions of workers struggling from paycheck to paycheck, low wages, poor benefits, harsh working conditions, limited work hours, poor job security, have left large numbers of workers in very dire circumstances. Therefore, I'll argue that we as UU should care about downtrodden workers and whether unionizing is a way to promote the welfare, worth, and dignity of every person as encouraged by our UU principles. Union organizing efforts at Amazon and Starbucks represent a change in the direction unionism is taking in the country. Whether the change is widespread and lasting, well, it's just unknown at the present time. We just don't have enough information yet. However, if history repeats itself, unions hold promise for improving the lives of Americans. Over the last 70 years or so, there's been a diminished role of unions in our country. You can see this by looking at the numbers. In the early 1950s, about 1/3 of the labor force was unionized. Now, 1/3 doesn't sound like a big number, but in that third, you had the automobile industry, the steel industry, commercial construction, transportation, the basic industries in the country, all unionized between about 1937, the enabling legislation was in 35, the constitutionality of the act was established in 37. So between 37 and the start of World War II, you had major union organizing taking place in this country, and that early organizing was solidified by the war, which promoted cooperation between labor and management. The impact of unions in the 30s through the 40s was certainly widespread, and it was meaningful. The situation today is fundamentally different. The proportion of the workforce unionized has shrunk to about 10%. And you have to recognize that 10% is almost optimistic. You look at the private sector, it's down there, it's 5, 6, 7%, something like that. And the 10% represents a heavier organization by government employees. Despite this history of decline, the tide might be turning by these successful organizing efforts at Starbucks and Amazon. Even employees at an Apple store are seeking union representation. In addition to these organizing efforts, which are clear positive signs that workers are looking towards unions again, it appears that the general attitude towards unions is also improving. Polls indicate that the union favorability perception among the public are at their highest level since 1965. So you've got the public more supportive of unions, you've got workers looking to unions, so something's changing there. Although the income of CEOs has skyrocketed in recent years and corporate profits are currently at a 50-year high, the wages of working Americans have flatlined for 40 years after you control for inflation. While wages have stagnated, the costs experienced by workers have continued to increase. People can't afford to buy a house. People can't afford to pay their rent. Parents can't afford to send their kids to college. Recent college graduates are buried in student loans. Too many people are just one illness or one injury away from bankruptcy. Unfortunately, living from paycheck to paycheck has become a way of life for too many people in this country. And as a result, the workers finding it hard to make ends meet, their version of the American dream is in real jeopardy, if not out of hand already. I guess I'm kind of pessimistic on that point. In a nation as wealthy as ours, there is a growing disenchantment with this battle for economic survival. Workers probably know that they can't depend on their employers to help them out of the situation that they're in. Too many employers have built their profitable businesses around a model that relies on low wages and poor benefits for the workforce. And so you can't go to your employer and say, improve things. It's going to be hard. I think most people, most workers also recognize that they can't look to government. Government's not going to be a solution to the economic problems faced by workers today. So if employers are more concerned about profits and people, and the government isn't able to help people, and provide some sort of relief, what can workers do? This is where we can look at history. In the past, workers have turned to unions during tough economic times. During the Great Depression, and as Margaret mentioned in the introduction, in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act was passed. The National Labor Relations Act gave workers the right to organize and engage in collective bargaining. At this time, the nation was in the midst of the Great Depression. There were millions of people working in factories where the working conditions were deplorable, wages were low, hours were long, conditions were hazardous, job-related injuries were commonplace, management practices were brutal, and at the same time there was very little individual workers could do to bring about needed change. However, though, once unions were enabled under the legislation. Once unionization started to take hold in this country, the situation changed, and it changed in fundamental ways. While individual workers had little power, no power, really, to change management practices, when they banded together into a union, the collective power of the group was formidable. Through the collective bargaining process, wages increased, the 8-hour day and the 5-day work week became standard. Employee benefits such as health insurance, pensions, paid vacations, paid holidays were established. The unions were also able to secure better treatment by supervisors. For example, in unionized settings, basic decisions that affected the lives of workers, such as who got promoted or who got laid off. Those kind of decisions were made at the whim of the supervisor. People who were liked by supervisors did okay. Those who weren't suffered. But with the introduction of unionism, contract terms such as seniority, length of service with the organization, was used to make basic decisions of who got promoted, who got laid off, who got transferred, those kinds of things. And that took power away from the supervisors to act arbitrarily, and gave an objective standard for the making of basic decisions that affected the lives of workers. Through unions and the collective bargaining process, workers were able to realize the American dream. A union job was a ticket to the middle class. Unionized workers could afford to buy a house, they could take vacations, they could send their kids to college. And all that could be done with one wage earner in the family. American workers became the envy of workers around the world. Well, that sounds like quite a success story. But again, you look at the history of organized labor in this country, what you see is the union movement started to struggle in major ways. No magical date. If you look at a variable like the percent of the workforce organized, which is a good measure of the impact of unions, it peaked in 1953 and started going down, but things really got bad in the 60s. That's when you really started to notice change, right around the time I started studying unions in the latter part of the 60s. Why was that? With all that success, I think it's a subject of another sermon. I had it in here and had to cut it out on why it happened, but it happened. The percent of the workforce organized declines rapidly and sharply. In way of background, two variables predict the decision to join a union. One variable is obvious: worker dissatisfaction. Dissatisfied workers are more likely to organize than satisfied workers. The second variable is a little more abstract. It's called instrumentality of unions. It's not enough to be dissatisfied to want to join a union. You have to be dissatisfied and believe that the union is a way for you to advance your objectives. The union has to be viewed as being instrumental in you personally getting better, getting more. And that's what workers want, is more. From the 1930s to the 1960s, instrumentality of unions was obvious. Those changes that I listed off earlier, the increased wages and shorter hours and fringe benefits, all those workers saw that, and they saw, yeah, unions make a difference. But instrumentality started to wane in the 60s. Unions simply weren't as effective as they had been. And there were consequences of that. Fewer workers organized, and unions were less successful at the bargaining table. They simply didn't deliver like they used to. Now, out of this picture of despair, at least for somebody like myself who supports as an arbitrator, I'm hired because they believe I'm objective, but I'm a fan of unions. I think workers who are dissatisfied should have the right to organize. And so it was a concern, because as things started to unravel, it's when I started studying unions as a graduate student, and it was most alarming. But out of this picture of despair, I think that the unionization of workers at companies like Starbucks and Amazon provides a glimmer of hope for American workers. Now, I say a glimmer of hope because winning a union representation election is not the same as negotiating a contract. Conditions don't improve in the workplace until the contract is negotiated. That's a generalization. We just saw in the news the last couple of days, Delta flight attendants are now getting paid from the time they get on the plane as opposed to the time when the door closes. So there's that period of time when the people are coming on and the door's open. They're not getting paid for that, and they're working. But the employees threaten to unionize, and now Delta pays them from the time they get on the plane. And so my general statement was that good things don't happen until there's an agreement in place. The threat of an agreement also helps good things happen. You don't see it all that often, but it does happen. Conditions don't improve until workers see that successful contract and have their lives changed as a result of it. You can bet that both Starbucks and Amazon will strenuously resist union organizing. And then if and when they are organized, you'll see them strenuously resist the unions at the bargaining table. Now, I want you to recognize what's going on. Why are companies just so resistant to union organizing? Especially profitable companies like Starbucks and Amazon. It's not like they can't afford to have richer pay and benefit packages. Unionization represents a shift in power, a shift in control. Before the company's unionized, the employer has complete control over decision-making processes of the business. They can run the business exactly the way they want to run it. For an example, at an Amazon warehouse, their way relies heavily on the use of computer monitoring of work to establish and enforce the rapid pace at which jobs have to be performed in order to avoid discipline, or in some cases even termination. And the idea is that it's the rapid pace, not the work itself, that leads to the high level of accidents. The injury rate at Amazon warehouse is almost twice the national average for the warehouse industry. So it's through this unilateral control of the operations that companies can maximize their profits. Once the company becomes unionized, it has to share its decisions, and under the terms of the National Labor Relations Act, it says they have to share the decisions over wages, hours, and other terms and conditions of employment. Staunchly anti-union companies like Amazon don't want to lose that control over their ability to computer monitor the work being performed. They believe it's essential to the efficient operation of their warehouses. And they're going to resist sharing decision-making affecting that aspect of their operations. And they'll go to the mat to protect their current decision-making powers. When it comes to union organizing, we've already seen that both Starbucks and Amazon have been willing to break the law in order to decrease the likelihood of unionization. The most obvious thing, both companies have terminated union organizers. You don't have to fire many people to chill interest in the union organizing drive. And so it doesn't cost them a whole lot of money and penalties to fire a union worker organizer or two to show interest. And then even after the union won the vote, about 55-45, it wasn't all that close. Even after the union won, Amazon filed a protest with the National Labor Relations Board, and they're trying to get the election to set aside. And if they say the election was illegal, then they'll be set aside and they'll remain a non-union operation. In addition to being tough during the organizing process to decrease the likelihood they have to deal with the union, they're also tough at the bargaining table if a union does get in. One of the nemesis of trade unions is the first contract. So workers vote for, there's an election held, and they vote for or against the union. The union, let's say the union wins, like let's say at a Starbucks or at this Amazon warehouse. Then attention shifts to the collective bargaining process and getting a contract. Getting that first contract is very difficult. It's difficult because there's no penalty under the law that deters the employer from simply dragging their feet during negotiations. The National Labor Relations Act says the employer is obligated to bargain in good faith, but nothing in the legislation requires the company to make a concession or to reach an agreement. And so they can talk and talk and talk. And what we know, what the numbers show, is that about 50% of those first contracts are not agreed to within a year, and about a third of the first contracts aren't agreed to after 3 years. And what happens is the employees look around and they say, hey, they're talking, but my job's getting no better. The dream's dashed. If they hope for the union to make a difference, what's being demonstrated is that the union doesn't count. It doesn't matter. And under the National Labor Relations Act, after 12 months, some disgruntled employee can file to get the union decertified. Another vote to vote the union out. The union has demonstrated it's not instrumental. And so that one of those key variables related to support for a union goes out the window because the unions prove that it's not instrumental. We've already seen examples. The union organizing at Starbucks and Amazon is brand new. We don't know much about what's happening in the collective bargaining process, but we get some signals. Starbucks hasn't been quiet about it. They've said that they will not start negotiations with the union at the existing level of wages and benefits, and then negotiate up from there. They're starting at zero with no guarantee that any contract that they reach will be as good as what the employees currently have. Tough. It's a tough stance. And you can be assured that when they get around to negotiating at Amazon, there's going to be tough resistance. Because the things that are on the worker's mind, length of breaks, the computer monitoring of the jobs, the accident and injuries on the job, those things right now are all influenced by the company unilaterally. And so they aren't going to talk about slowing down the pace. They aren't going to talk about giving workers more time during the day to rest through longer break periods. They aren't going to do those things because the efficiency of the warehouse depends on those demanding practices. So we haven't seen it yet, but don't be surprised if you start reading about just how tough the company, Amazon, is being at the bargaining table. I don't think we should get too giddy about the potential for a sharp turnaround in the lives of working Americans because of the recent victories at Amazon and Starbucks. I hate to be a Debbie Downer on that, but I'm not all that optimistic. I think they're positive signs, but the proof will be in the contracts that are ultimately negotiated. If they bring about revised working conditions that revitalize the American dream, that American workers will be better off, and but that will be a function of how good those contracts are, if contracts are negotiated at all. Let me just, in wrapping up, let me just quickly mention a couple things, several things that we can do as UUs to help improve working conditions for downtrodden workers in this country. We can support efforts to raise the minimum wage. That's a place to start. $7.25 just isn't enough. It's been in place for, I don't know, a decade or so. Just not enough. Going after a living wage, there's debate on how big that is. It's $15, $18, $20 an hour. But certainly, we need progress on the minimum wage, and we can support politicians who agree with that position. We can support politicians who are willing to make it easier to unionize. Simple changes in the law. We know what it takes to get us union success. One is shorten the time period in which the election takes place. The optimum time is 3 weeks, 21 days. We've got research on that point. But employers can drag it out, and the longer they drag it out, the less likely the union is to win. So we can hasten that process along. We can support politicians who agree with efforts to keep unemployment low and to grow the number of jobs. The strong demand for labor can help pressure employers to treat employees better. We can boycott companies that aggressively and illegally resist union organizing efforts. We can respect picket lines. We can watch for the union label, and we can buy American-made union goods. So there are things we can do. Unions aren't a perfect institution. They have their problems. But other than the strong labor market, they are still the best hope for eliminating power differences between employers and employees that can lead to the abuse of employee rights. When there's a healthier balance of power between employees and their employers, there's a better chance that the lives of working Americans will improve. So are unions the answer to the economic tough times faced by workers today? My answer is it's a guarded yes. But wresting greater control over the workplace from greedy employers is going to be a formidable task. We'll have to wait and see if these fledgling unions, like those at Starbucks and Amazon, are up for the challenge. Thank you.